to do some remembering. The last few weeks, we've been talking about faith. And I want us to remember a little bit about what is faith and what have we been talking about. So one of the first things that we remember is when we talked about faith, faith is trusting and believing. Faith isn't something we can see. We trust and we believe. Now, last week, remember this? We learned that faith is not being able to see, but faith is putting our trust in the one that can see for us. So we remember that faith, when we want to put our faith in the most important, wonderful person ever, we put our faith in God. And what's one reason why we put our faith in God? Because we learned He loves us very, very much. God loves you, Fiona. God loves you, Eden, and you, Selah, and you, Piper, and you, Everly. And I think there's someone that I don't know your name back there, but God loves you too. Sophie, God loves Sophie very, very much. We learned about some seeds. You know, we can have faith as small as a tiny seed, and God can do something great big in our life. Just like a mustard seed, it can grow really, really big. And God only needs a little bit of faith to do a big thing in our life. And sometimes we have to wait. Remember how I planted a seed? Did anybody have faith that it would grow?
Your dad did.
A little bit. It grew a little bit. I have my plant here. And even though we had to wait, we have some little plants here. And we couldn't see the seeds grow that first day or the next day or the day after that. But even when we couldn't see, things were happening. And that happens in our life too, where we can have faith and know God is in control, and little things are still happening, or big things are even still happening, even when we can't see. Miss Debbie's going to tell us a story about some faith and about how God works even when we don't know how God could be in control.
So we've been talking about faith, and especially faith in Jesus, because we know Jesus is the Son of God, and he has great power. We learned that 2,000 years ago when he walked on the earth, he also walked on water. And Peter had faith to walk on water also. And Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. Now, that same Jesus from 2,000 years ago is alive today, and still we can have faith in him. And about 200 years ago, there was an army, and especially a general, General George Washington, who had faith in Jesus. And General George Washington became our first president. You see, it was August of 1776, and the Americans were in battle with the British. They were in battle for their freedom. On August 27th, they had been fighting all morning and into the afternoon. There was about 11,000 of the Americans to 20,000 of the British, as well as the Navy that was nearby. It did not look good for the Americans. They had lots of losses that day. They were being pushed back and pushed back and pushed back until they were up against a river, a mile-long river, and there was nowhere for them to go. They were at a dead end. They were trapped. It was in Brooklyn Heights. There was a few hours left in the day, so they knew that at any moment the British would be attacking them and they would not be able to win. They would have to surrender. But General George Washington and many of his troops were men of prayer. And I believe they were praying that day because in Brooklyn Heights, several miracles happened. The first miracle happened when the British did not attack. If you read the journals of both of those armies, there is no good reason why that general of the British Army chose not to attack. But he didn't. He decided to wait for the next day. Miracle number 2 happened the next day when a great storm came with very strong winds, so strong that the Navy, who was up that river, would not be able to come and capture the Americans. And it was one of those hard, pelting rains that hit your face and you don't want to be out in it. And the British obviously didn't want to be out in it because they stayed in their tents and they did not attack. That gave General Washington all day to come up with a plan. It was a risky plan, but he sent his soldiers, he said, go find as many fishing boats as you can find, and we're going to get our army, 8,000 men, across this river, a mile-long river. So they did. They went and they found as many fishing boats as they can, and it just so happens that the last recruits were some of the best fishermen of the land. They knew how to row the boat, and even though it was stormy and the waters were choppy, they started loading men into the boat, the soldiers, and going the mile across the river. And they would come back and they would load more soldiers, and they'd go a mile across the river, and they were slowly escaping. About midnight, the storm stopped. It became very still, and the sky became clear. And that was not good for the Americans, because on water, sound travels very easily down water. And if the Navy at the end of the river heard them going back and forth, well, they're going to come right up the river and capture them. So it was very important that they stay very, very quiet as they could. And those very expert oarsmen could put their oars into the water and lift it up and make very little sound. But still, 8,000 men are going back and forth, back and forth. How could the Navy not hear them and come and get them? But that was miracle number 3. The Navy did not hear them, and the Navy did not come. So they just kept going back and forth, back and forth. And then it was dawn. The sun was starting to come up. But there were still several thousand men waiting to escape. If the British saw what they were doing, they were going to rush in and capture them. And both journals from both armies record that at that time, a fog started coming up from the ground, a very dense fog started coming up from the ground. It covered the river. It covered both armies, and neither army could see very far at all. So you know what? The Americans just kept bringing men over to the other side, over to the other side. And when the last boat was filled with men, and George Washington was in that boat, and it started crossing to the other side, the fog lifted. And the army, the British army, could see what was happening. They ran, they got their guns, they ran to the shore, and they started shooting. But it was too late because the Americans were too far away. 8,000 men escaped that day. And they gave thanks to Jesus. Jesus protected them because Jesus is the Son of God, and he has great power. Jesus had great power 2,000 years ago. He had great power 200 years ago. And Jesus has great power today. And we have faith in Jesus.